The way we fight our battles in America for political power,
for control,
for the future, is unlike any other kind of warfare.
The political battlefield is inside people's minds.
And it's a battle of persuasion, trying to get other people to change what they do.
To vote
the way you want. But somehow when we talk about political campaigns,
we only hear about the big picture.
The money, maps, media. We almost never talk about minds.
Minds.
The place where the real action is. This is the War to Win Minds.
A limited series about how the political battle is really won and lost inside our brain.
I'm Matt Robeson, a writer, podcaster, and former campaign manager.
And I'm Lauren Goldstein, a psychologist and pollster for change research.
We'll dive into the hidden psychology of politics, why some things work.
And some things don't.
And we're starting with the biggest thing that campaigns do, political ads.
We'll break down what the techniques are
and show you how to spot what ad makers are trying to do a mile away.
You can hear new episodes every week in the Beyond Politics podcast
and watch them on the Cliff's Edge channel on YouTube. This is episode 1, the 2 paths to persuade. If you're trying to get into someone's brain, there are 2 roads to get there, the central and the peripheral. One's about logic, facts, and evidence. The other's about emotions, feelings, and fleeting gut-level perceptions. Think about them like the local and the express roads into our minds. And our minds are built to use both. The problem is, if you use the wrong one at the wrong time, it's kind of like driving into rush hour traffic. You just won't get anywhere. And that's a trap that Democrats have been particularly prone to in the past. Too much of the slow, fact-driven, brain-intensive central road. Not enough peripheral emotion and vibes. It's even something The Simpsons made fun of.
The top fifth is consuming 60% of our nation's resources, while the bottom 2/5 is consuming 1/8. Hence my campaign slogan, end quintile disparity.
Look, we all care about quintile disparity, but the Democrats can't win with another prissy brainiac.
Thank you, Senator Winterdale. That's Whiner Girl.
Although The Simpsons have predicted everything, including the slogans of dull-witted demagogues.
I just want to use you. Maybe I want to use them. Maybe you what? Use them to make this country great again.
So in this episode, we're first going to take a look at some examples of each of these 2 routes into the brain and understand how they work. And then we'll take a look at how they're playing out in the presidential campaign right now, by breaking down Kamala Harris's first ad out of the gate to see whether it's getting the balance right or wrong. And finally, we'll take a look ahead at why understanding this fundamental psychology principle is going to be critical to who will win this campaign. Let's bring in Lauren.
Lauren, are you coming to this episode down the central or the peripheral road?
I'm coming central today. I'm bringing the facts.
You are all facts. You are Dr. Lauren Goldstein. I feel like the fugitive.
Dr. Richard Kimball.
Dr. Lauren Goldstein. All right. Before we get to today's topic, let's just, for 1 minute, talk about why ads. I sound like, why male models from Zoolander? But why focus on ads?
It's the number one way that we try to persuade each other about politics. Almost 3/4 of the money spent on campaigns this year is going to go to ads, a bit on social media, but mostly on TV. And as a pollster, a lot of my work focuses on coming up with the best possible messages for candidates and causes and organizations so that TV experts can turn them into ads. I want to note that, yes, we are in an age of fragmented media. We're in an age of social media, and that has actually meaningful implications for how these ads get seen. A lot of it is happening digitally. It's happening on Twitter. It's happening in the group chat. So these are very much still getting a lot of play, getting a lot of attention, and reaching a lot of people, just perhaps in more modern ways.
There is pretty compelling evidence from the political science research, from the literature, that ads work some of the time. We're just not great at predicting which ones are going to work when. And that is the most critical piece of information that we can have, those of us who are interested in campaigns and interested in winning and persuading our fellow Americans in the direction that we feel so passionately about. That's what we're focused on here. How do you do them right? So with that, all right, let's get into what this whole episode comes from something you were starting to explain to me. It's sort of the ground level first thing to understand about how the brain works when we encounter political messages. There are these 2 routes into the brain. Let's talk about the central route first. What is it?
Using data and facts and evidence and logic to make a really strategic, rational, informed decision about something. You have to be bringing a lot of attention, a lot of motivation, a lot of intellectual resources and capacity in order to not just process all of that information, but be motivated to engage in that process in the first place. So I'll give an example, right? Let's take ourselves back to March or April of 2020 and say, I am trying to persuade a person to wear a mask. COVID is raging. We don't have a handle on this yet. What is it that I can do to get you to wear a mask? If I'm taking the central route of processing, what I'm doing is I'm showing you scientific data on rates of transmission when you're masked versus unmasked. I'm citing peer-reviewed research from top journals. I'm soliciting consensus from scientific professionals. I'm making a point of showing you just how many of them agree that masking really does limit exposure and transmission. This is the central route of processing to try to get you, a skeptic, to come on board. What the central route of processing requires you to do is be really motivated to engage and take an active role in absorbing all of that information. So it can produce more stable attitude change, partly because you've gone through all of that really deliberate, conscious process of making your decision. But it's really only effective under certain conditions.
So you've got to get people who are willing to engage the brain and put in a little bit of work. It's like that joke about how many psychologists does it take? Lauren, how many psychologists does it take to change a light bulb?
I actually have one for this. The answer is one.
But
you
the
have to
light
really
bulb has to want to change.
You got it.
So, I mean, that's really the audience we're talking about here. Now, some of our audience may have heard of the very famous Daniel Kahneman book, Thinking Fast and Slow. He's like one of my intellectual heroes. Is this a similar idea?
Yeah, super related. Brain system 1 versus system 2 thinking. How much of it is relying on facts and deliberative process in your mind, and how much of it is sort of peripheral details, emotional appeals, etc. So yeah, a lot of parallel.
If you use central and you're willing to get someone who, I should say, they're willing to engage on facts and pay some attention to what you're doing, then you could have an effect that really lasts. You can really change people's minds. But it sounds like the problem is, again, if you have a light bulb that doesn't want to change, you might as well just be, like the kids in the Peanuts cartoons, wah, wah, wah.
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, more or less. Most of us do not have the capacity to engage the central route for most of our decisions. That is another thing that I want to make super clear. This is not a judgment against voters or against a certain segment of voters. This is more, how do all of our brains work? How are we all sort of functioning through the day? We do not have the time and the resources to go through the central route for every decision.
What's a good example for people to wrap their heads around when central communication goes wrong?
So we don't really want to put any of our Democratic allies on the spot, especially in an election year, by picking on their ads. So what we want to look at instead is a clip from the 1988 debate between Dukakis and Bush.
Governor, if Kitty Dukakis were raped and murdered, would you favor an irrevocable death penalty for the killer?
No, I don't, Bernard, and I think you know that I've opposed the death penalty during all of my life. I don't see any evidence that it's a deterrent, and I think there are better and more effective ways to deal with violent crime. We've done so in my own state, and it's one of the reasons why we have had the biggest drop in crime of any industrial state in America, why we have the lowest murder rate of any industrial state in America.
So why, from a central versus peripheral standpoint, was that so criticized?
Essentially because he just went straight to the central route, right? There was no moment of acknowledgement of the emotional impact of this hypothetical. Your wife has been brutally assaulted and killed. Would you support the death penalty for her killer? Regardless of his policy, that was a moment where he needed to establish some degree of emotional human connection to the question, and it didn't happen.
He needed to say, I would want to kill the killer. That's, of course, I would. Anyone would want to defend their family, would want to protect their spouse, and would want revenge. And the reason we have laws and we have the rule of law is to protect ourselves from ourselves. And then you can go into your, in Massachusetts, this is, as a governor, this is what I have to do, and this is what I've achieved. That would be fine. But you make an interesting point, which is that the peripheral route, acknowledging the emotion, empathizing with the situation and with your audience, it's sort of the key that unlocks the attention of your audience. It's sort of the ante you have to pay to get into their brain. So let's talk about the peripheral. What do we think about with the peripheral route when it comes to ads and political communications?
An important thing to start off with is most people, when they're consuming an ad, they're doing it passively. They're not necessarily engaging their brain. They're not elaborating. They're not seeking out evidence immediately afterwards. So what it's incumbent on us to do is capture their attention by engaging their emotions, by telling stories, with negative or positive associations with the material, anything that's going to make them feel something so that they will retain your message. It's sort of meeting them where they are a little bit. And this is a really essential avenue to persuasion when you don't have that perfect alignment of motivation, capacity, and interest to take the central route. So if I'm recycling that example of trying to persuade a skeptic to wear a mask during the COVID outbreak of early 2020, maybe I'm showcasing a person that you like and respect, like an athlete or an actor, talking about why they wear a mask, right? The peripheral route is really going to rely on those emotive details, those positive associations, and social trends wherever possible to try to sink in and grab you.
What I hear you saying is there are principles of persuasion. I learned about them in grad school. I didn't go on to become Dr. Lauren Goldstein. There are things like liking, credibility, authority, and relying on what is sometimes called valence issues, things that everyone feels very strongly one way or the other about: patriotism, family, love. Before we get into looking at some ads, which I desperately want to do, there's so many misconceptions about communication, about the peripheral, the central, how we use facts, how we use emotion. Give me an example of a myth. What's something that everyone gets wrong?
Yeah, I love the question. And this is probably the single myth that I care the most about busting, so I'm probably going to bring it up over and over, which is we assume that these cognitive processes are things that other people do, right? So this entire time that we're talking about taking the central route or taking the peripheral route, we are all approaching this through the lens of how other people behave, because we fancy ourselves incredibly rational, intelligent beings, right? We are all somehow above average, despite the fact that averages exist for a reason. What I want to myth bust here is that social psychology is the study of how all of us behave. I assure you, listener, that there are more domains in your life where the peripheral route of processing dictates how you make decisions.
Yeah, let's take a look at one of the ads. This is an ad from right here in this cycle that does a pretty good job of using the peripheral route.
It's 6 a.m. and up on this overpass, these guys are already at it. Starting early to beat the heat, staying late because that's what it takes. I'm Sharice Davids. I worked with local officials, Republicans and Democrats, on a plan to fix bridges and roads like this all over Kansas. Then worked with Republicans in Washington to pass it. Keeping these guys on the job and boosting our economy. I approve this message. They work hard and work together. Washington should too.
All right, so what jumps out to you about that?
She's doing a lot of things really well. First of all, she has completely aligned herself with the people who are the center of this message, which is regular people, in this case, folks who are working to improve our infrastructure. She's dressed like them. There's energetic music, and she's just really physically, visually aligned herself with them and kind of made them the hero of the message.
I completely agree, and we're going to return over and over again in this series to principles of persuasion. This is unity, liking. She's really identifying with the people that she's trying to message to. One of the things I also like, and I'm going to back this up a second here, is you see here she's talking to a construction worker. She's listening, but she's also doing some of the talking, right? And that's especially important to some authority, the fact that she's someone who knows what she's talking about. And look, she's a person of smaller physical stature. And I think that this is there's a visual cue coming here that even though she's shorter than all the people around her, they're paying attention when she's walking and talking. And I love that.
Yeah, it really casts her as somebody with gravitas, somebody to really be taken seriously, but not in a distant way, in a I'm right there in it with you way, and I'm fighting for and championing what you're doing.
One of the things that also jumps out to me just from a technical standpoint is so many rapid cuts, so much movement. You have a lot of handheld cam. I don't think that there's an image that's on the screen for more than a second and a half in the whole thing. So the music is dynamic, the motion is dynamic. Even if you're watching this right now with the sound off, the takeaway is action, energy. This is someone who's on the job and working. It sounds like what people should remember, the real takeaway here when it comes to central versus peripheral and understanding how much of each is the right amount, is that it doesn't have to be one or the other, and it really shouldn't be. One of the things that one of my mentors in communications, Dave Gergen, who's an analyst, has worked for 4 presidents, he's an analyst on CNN, he used to say to me is, never a story without a statistic, never a statistic without a story. You want to weave your central and your peripheral together. If you're doing an ad, you want to be like 80, 90% peripheral. All right, let's take everything that you just gave us and take a look at Kamala Harris's first big ad. It's called Freedom. And let's see what we can spot. And I urge the viewers to play along. Let's see what you can spot as we go through this ad.
In this election, we each face a question. What kind of country do we want to live in? There are some people who think we should be a country of chaos, of fear, of hate. But us, we choose something different. We choose freedom. The freedom not just to get by, but get ahead. The freedom to be safe from gun violence. The freedom to make decisions about your own body. We choose a future where no child lives in poverty, where we can all afford health care, where no one is above the law. We believe in the promise of America, and we're ready to fight for it. Because when we fight, we win. So join us. Go to KamalaHarris.com and let's get to work.
My first reaction is, that's a banger from Beyonce. That is just an awesome song. Thank you, Beyonce Knowles. What do you see in here?
I love this ad. So some stray details here. As you just mentioned, Beyonce song is the star. And so the sort of underlying implication here is there's some alignment between Beyonce and the candidate that I think for, a passive viewer is really appealing. And it strikes an incredible contrast here. I think her core message, she says, it's fear, chaos, and hate versus freedom, the ultimate American value. And she's doing a really effective job as casting this as an us situation. We have a choice. What are we going to choose? We choose freedom. So it's not I, and it's not even you. She's really making herself part of it. And the importance of that can't really be overstated when it comes to trying to communicate with voters. And I would say the ad could have ended even before the final lyrical line because all the points had basically been made, but the inclusion felt really impactful. That last lyric where she says, I'm going to keep running because a winner don't quit on themselves, just like ending with grit and power and determination in language that honestly sounds like a professional athlete. Like it almost had the tone of like a Gatorade ad there at the very end in the best possible way. The whole ad is primarily about us, but that ending just reinforces we have a really powerful leader in our midst. And I loved that. I've got more to say, but I really want to know what you're noticing.
I noticed a bunch of small things, like we were saying with the Sharice Davids ad. A lot of motion. You can see it right here. Not quite as rapid a set of cuts as in the earlier ad, but pretty rapid. And obviously the music, just a ton of energy. One of the audiences that you have to appeal to if you're a Democrat is young voters. The old writing advice, show it, don't tell it. There's no better way to get across that there's a contrast here in terms of age versus youth and dynamism and energy than to just show it in your ad. That really comes through. And I'll just point out one little technical thing that I'm going to jump to here in the ad because we're about to go for a replay. The first 5 seconds comes in with the music, and then it expends a lot of time on this image that I paused on right here. That's a lot of real estate to use up in your ad, in an ad that's a little over a minute long. Just paused here. It's not a downtown urban setting. It's not a completely rural setting. It's kind of a suburban setting. Guess who your core audience is? And it just brings me back to another of those persuasion principles. Know your audience. They're in charge. What they're interested in is what you need to care about. And that comes through here. This is a visual cue to tell the audience member, I'm talking to you.
Yeah, absolutely. And then I think I just want to note as well that to dwell on the freedom message choice that this ad is making for a moment, that is an outstanding message. And it's one that's really well validated by research we at Change Research and other partner organizations have been conducting over the last year to help broadly shape this democratic strategy. This use of freedom, it reflects a really concerted effort to reassert some of those core American values as core democratic principles when making our case to America for what we stand for. And you heard it all in that ad. It's the freedom to choose, the freedom to love, the freedom to thrive, to be safe and secure, the freedom to pursue the American dream. Like the list goes on. And that has to be the fundamental case that we are making to the American people.
Since you mentioned it, let's just listen to this key section. This is 36 seconds into the ad.
The freedom not just to get by, but get ahead. The freedom to be safe from gun violence. The freedom to make decisions about your own body. We choose a future where no child lives in poverty, where we can all afford health care, where no one is above the law.
So what you're hearing is you've gone 36 seconds into an ad, and this is the first time you hear anything that smacks of an issue. Everything before that is totally thematic. It's totally valence feelings about freedom, about change, about the contrast to something dark and scary and rageful. And then having unlocked the brain, hopefully, with that peripheral root messaging, then you have an opportunity. And this is not very central, right? It's not a lot of facts and figures, not a lot of numbers in here, but you get the introduction of a few thematic central-ish points for just 14 seconds. And then you're back. You're right back to peripheral.
What I love about this ad is it really feels like it's a product of this exact moment in time when it was released. Because you're right, it takes 36 seconds into the ad for an issue to get mentioned. And everything before it is just really good vibes. And it feels like that is exactly where the party has been for the last few weeks. It's just like riding this vibe high. Like people are so enthused. They're so excited. There's this renewed sense of optimism. And I feel like this ad really reflected back to us that sentiment in a great way.
Kamala Harris is doing exactly the right thing here, establishing the big themes. This is not only politics 101 and psychology 101, it's just what you need to do to not get sucked into kind of the nitpicking, fact-checking backlash from the other side. And I'm sure that's great for the media. I'm being a little anti-media, and here I am like a member of the media. But I just want to reinforce that this is the right thing. By the way, I have to note here that there's this great little auditory right after this suburbs moment. We get to
Who think we should be a country of chaos, of fear, of hate. But us, we choose something different.
Yeah.
They put in this hissing sound when they're doing the images of Trump. So anyway, it's just there's subtext, there's text, and it's spot on to me.
I couldn't agree more. I loved it.
So I want to go back to something you said a moment ago, that this is part of some work that Change Research that you have helped to lead, your organization and you personally, around freedom framing and kind of recapturing the power of that. What else do we know from your polling work, from your focus grouping, from all of the research that you do about how effective this messaging is and whether or not Kamala Harris is on the right track here?
Well, I think it's important to situate her strategy, this ad, this moment in time, in its broader context, because it feels like years ago, but it's been less than a month since Joe Biden was our nominee. We're in a different world, but it's taking a couple of weeks for the polls and the public opinion data to catch up and reflect the trends back to us. And I don't think this is any secret, but with Biden at the top of the ticket, we were kind of bleeding support with young people and with people of color in particular. And it wasn't just the horse race numbers. It was reflected in a huge enthusiasm gap to vote, to show up. Young people in particular were just reflecting that to us in focus groups, in polls, in one-on-one interviews for at least a year, that they were just incredulous and despondent that Trump and Biden were their choices. It wasn't what they wanted. And it turns out that they really weren't lying when they said they wanted somebody else. They wanted a fresh candidate. And in the weeks since Biden has dropped out, Harris's numbers have just been on the rise pretty steadily. So at Change Research, we conducted a poll immediately after Biden decided not to pursue the nomination and dropped out. And that data showed a really narrow lead for Harris over Trump and a marked improvement on the Democratic margins with those key groups, young people of color. I'll borrow a line from the Obama campaign because that's what this whole energy feels like. They're fired up and ready to go. And I think that this ad, bringing it back to the ad, was really a tone setter for the Harris campaign. And it's all done through this lens of empowerment. This is really a great encapsulation of what all of the data has supported as a strategy and is really geared toward those groups that we really needed to revitalize.
Just to pick up on what you're saying there, I actually used some of Change Research's polling. I cited it in an article I wrote for Newsweek about why Kamala Harris selected Tim Walz as her vice presidential running mate. And part of the argument there was that her first mission, the most important thing she needed to do right out of the gate, is to reconsolidate the Democratic base that had begun to drift away when Biden was still the nominee. And they were going to RFK Jr. or they were going to undecided. And what you see in the messaging in this ad is an attempt to sound this key persuasion principle, this key psychology principle, unity, social proof. There's this moment where they pause the music and you just hear the crowd going, Kamala. That idea of the social cue of we're all back together, the band's back together again, that is so critical. And you see the messaging meet what you're finding in your polling, which is RFK Jr. sinking. And all of that support is flowing right back to Kamala Harris. And that's why she's overtaken and jumped out ahead of Donald Trump in your polling. With that, let's go to the takeaways. Number one, the first thing I've learned from you here is if you want to get into someone's mind, the first thing you have to start with is understanding both routes, the central and the peripheral. Don't forget about either of them, but use them in the right proportions. You got to find that right balance. And the other thing I'm hearing from you is Democrats are getting better and better at using the peripheral route. That's why we couldn't find a great example of ads that are going down that kind of stereotyped too central, we're robots, Democrats route. But it's still a tempting thing for us. We're still, this is the way our brains work. And so we have to be wary, and we have to look at models like this Harris ad to remind ourselves this is the starting point.
I think all of that is right. It's a catch-22 in some ways, because what voters, and we're going to get into this, I think, in subsequent episodes, but what voters tell us they want is not necessarily what they actually want. An example of that is, I think, everything that we've been talking about here today, right? If you ask someone, an average person, what is it that you want in a leader? Or if a leader is trying to ask you for their vote, what is it that you want to know? They're going to say, I want facts. I want you to tell me where you stand on X, Y, Z. I want you to tell me what you're going to do for me. How are you going to make my kitchen table concerns get better? That's all I want. I don't want you to be overly emotional. I just want you to tell me the real. The reality is that doing that is incredibly ineffective. And what is incumbent on us to do is thread that needle. We need to give them information through an emotive appeal. And by using all of those peripheral route cues and strengths to our best advantage.
That's a great preview for where we're going. And so for folks, if you like what you're hearing here, hang on. We're going to have more episodes coming up. Lauren, thanks so much.
Thank you, Matt. This is fun.